If we can, we'll go ahead and bring this meeting to order. This is the November 9th, 2017 meeting of the Jefferson City Planning and Zoning Commission. My name is Chris Jordan, and I am the chairman of this commission. I would like to remind the commission members, anyone in the audience, to please silence all your electronic devices. And then for the commission members, if you would, make sure to turn on your microphones when speaking so that the audience and anyone that's watching this evening can hear. With that being said, we will move on to introductions. I do not see anyone from City Council this evening. Okay, so we have no one from City Council this evening, so Michael, if you'd start, please.
Mike Lester.
Jack Deacon.
Bob George.
Dale Vaughn.
Ann Stropman, City Staff.
Bunny Tricky Cotton.
Matt Hall.
Blake Marcus.
Michelle Mahoney.
Shane Wade, City Staff.
Eric Barron, City Staff.
Sonny Sanders, City Staff.
Brian Wolford, City Staff.
Jamie Abbott, City Staff.
Thank you, everyone. Procedural matters. The City Code authorizes 9 regular members and 3 alternates. Alternates are designated to vote upon the absence or disqualification of a regular member. A quorum of 5 members or alternates is necessary to conduct business. I do believe that we will have a quorum this evening, and the members will be, you want to read it? You want me to do it? I'll do it. Bunny Tricky Cotton, Jack Deacon, Bob George, Michael Lester, Dale Vaughn, Blake Marcus, Matthew Hall, Michelle Mahoney, and Dean Dutoy has just arrived. Perfect timing. With that being said, the following regular members are absent this evening: Chris Yarnell and David Nunn. Are there any members who are disqualified from voting on any agenda item? Okay, we're seeing none. So then the voting members will be Bunny Tricky Cotton, Jack Deacon, Dean Dutoy, Bob George, Michael Lester, Dale Vaughn, Blake Marcus, and Matthew Hall. Michelle, you can participate, but this evening we won't let you vote. Next, we will have a call for cases. So if there's someone in the audience who is here to represent that case, if you would just raise your hand so we know that you're here. Our first case would be case P17021, 1707 Stadium Boulevard. Is there someone here to represent that? Thank you, gentlemen. Our next case is case number P17022, is a text amendment pertaining to the historic preservation. I believe city staff will be.
That's correct.
All right. Have we received any requests for continuances?
No.
Okay. Have we received any request to reorder the agenda?
No.
All right. Eric, if you would you please read the format of the hearing and order of testimony?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to briefly describe the procedures of the Planning Commission. The proceedings of the meeting are being recorded, so I ask that when you speak, please step to the microphone and give your name and address for the record prior to giving comments. After a brief introduction by city staff, the applicant and applicant's consultants and advisors will explain the project. The opening presentation shall be limited to 10 minutes, although the applicant shall be given 3 additional minutes for closing testimony if so requested. We will then ask to hear from supporters of the request. We will then ask to hear from any opponents of the request. We will then ask to hear from anyone else who wishes to speak on the request. And the testimony from supporters, opponents, or other interested parties shall be limited to 3 minutes each. City staff will then describe the proposal and make their recommendations on the request. In order to reduce the time necessary to hear an application, reference to printed material including staff reports, applicable findings, ordinances, and/or statutes shall not be read into the record unless directed by the Commission. And the staff reports and recommendations, if any, on any matter before the Commission shall be presented to the Commission before the Commission acts on the matter. The Commission will close testimony from the floor after all public comments have been received. Prior to motion or discussion of the case, the Commission will then discuss the proposal, then publicly make its determination with reasons. The form of the motion shall be positive. That is, the motion shall be made to accept the request as it is presented or with any modifications, stipulations, or conditions. And a final vote taken, ayes in favor, Nays opposed. And the chairman shall announce the results of the vote, specifying the number of votes cast in favor and the number of votes cast against. The following documents are entered as exhibits for all items under consideration at this meeting: the City Code of the City of Jefferson as amended, the Comprehensive Plan and Land Use Map, copies of applications under consideration, a list of property owners to whom notices were sent, the affidavit of publication of public notice in the newspaper, copies of drawings, plans, and or renderings under consideration, letters or memoranda from staff, the staff reports, minutes of proceedings, and letters, photos, memoranda, or other materials submitted by the public or the applicant, the rules of procedure for the Jefferson City, Missouri Planning and Zoning Commission. And these items are public record and available for inspection in the Department of Planning and Protective Services or through the Office of the City Clerk. And please be advised that any items that are presented to the Planning and Zoning Commission this evening become property of the Commission. This includes any photographs, drawings, renderings, petitions, and letters. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate that. Next, we'll move on to the adoption of the agenda. I will entertain an adoption of the agenda as printed.
Move to adopt the agenda as printed.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say aye. All opposed, motion carried. City staff, Ann, has provided us the minutes from the regular meeting of the October 12th, 2017 commission meeting. When the commission's ready, we will entertain a motion on that. We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor? All opposed? Motion carries. We have received some communication this evening. We have approximately, or actually we have 11 things of correspondence, whether they're emails or actual hand-delivered letters. They are all for case number P17022 for the text amendment for the historic preservation. I will let Eric discuss those when we get to that case, but all the commission members have received those, and Eric, I think, is going to give us kind of a brief overview on some of those at that time. With that being said, we will move on to new business. We will move on to case number P17021, 1707 Stadium Boulevard. It is a rezoning from RS4 to CO and a comprehensive plan amendment. Eric, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, to orient you to the location of this property, up on the screen is a location map with the property highlighted. So the intersection of Southwest Boulevard and Stadium Boulevard, a fairly major intersection in our community, is located there towards the center of the screen. The property is just to the southeast corner of that intersection. So it's actually two properties that are highlighted on the screen, although the request really only pertains to the residential house on the right-hand side. But it's an office building located right there at the corner, and then the neighboring residential house that's under the same ownership. And so the applicants, Bert and Jane Deerhoff, are the owners of the property there. And their desire is to construct a parking lot to serve the office building back behind in the rear yard area of the residential lot. So there is some zoning history on this case. Skip ahead to, well, the zoning map. The rear portion of this residential lot was rezoned from an RS2 single family district to an RS4 and a CO, kind of a split zoning district on the property back in March of 2009. And it was for the same purpose at the time, although they didn't ultimately pursue the construction of the parking lot at that time. They're coming forward today to try to finalize those plans and proceed with construction. So at that time, the zoning of the front portion of the lot was changed to a less dense, a zoning district that allowed for a smaller residential lot, and then the rear portion of the lot to a commercial office category to support a commercial parking lot to serve the neighboring office. And they drew a zoning line in there based on conceptual plans that they had for how to fit the parking lot and a driveway into that space. The zoning was approved through the Planning and Zoning Commission, ultimately by the City Council, so the property was rezoned. However, they never split the lot. Ultimately, that would be their goal, is to divide the property, the residential house, from the rear portion, so that the residential house would be a standalone property, and then the rear portion would basically be connected to the commercial lot. So that was back in 2009. So this proposal is, they have come forward with I think a more refined parking lot construction plan, and came to the realization that they need a little bit more space in order to fit the parking lot and driveway into that area. And so it is a rezoning proposal to rezone a little bit more of the single-family residential portion of the property to commercial office in order to support the planned commercial parking lot. The goal would again be to divide the property so that the single-family home exists on its own property, and the commercial parking lot is again essentially connected to the office property. Would be a comprehensive plan amendment as well. So they've requested a comprehensive plan amendment. As is common, the single-family zone portion of the property is identified as a medium density residential on the comprehensive plan development plan map. So the proposal is to redesignate again that area to commercial to support the requested rezoning. The area is shown up on the screen there. It consists of 1,120 square feet, give or take a few. This is an aerial photo, 2015 air photo of the property. Currently, the residential property is just yard area. And then I think the consultant has passed out to you some good engineer drawings, essentially showing how the parking lot would fit on the property. I also show that up on the screen. I think it would be a different visual, but showing the same information on how a parking lot would connect to the existing office parking area. It'd be via a driveway on the southern side of the building. It would be a fairly steep slope going down and around a corner in order to fit parking spaces back there. This case was filed concurrently with a request before the Board of Adjustment for 4 different variances in order to accommodate this. 2 variances dealing with essentially the driveway at the connection at the southern side of the building, and 2 variances dealing with the residential home and splitting that off from what would be the commercial portion of the property. And so those 4 variances are scheduled to appear in front of the Jefferson City Board of Adjustment on Tuesday, next Tuesday. But they are, while connected, independent from consideration by this body for the rezoning. I think that's all I have for now. I'd be happy to answer any initial questions. The applicant's consultant is here, and might be able to provide any more technical details on the proposal.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Do any of the commission members have any questions for Eric at this point regarding this? Shane, will you have anything regarding this request, or will we get to you later?
Since it's a rezoning, I do not.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Let me touch on that just a little. There is the parking lot plan that's submitted, for the purposes of the Board of Adjustment is preliminary in nature. There would have to be a final engineered site plan complying with all requirements of the city code, except of course the ones that, any variances that might be issued. Stormwater and other features, landscaping, would be accommodated on that final version of the code. So they have some preliminary ideas on how the stormwater would flow, but it's not a finalized plan.
And just so we're clear, Eric, basically what we're charged with here tonight is the actual rezoning of the land, not necessarily the layout of the parking lot or anything that goes with that. We're here addressing the area of rezoning. Now, obviously, they wouldn't need the rezoning if they didn't want the parking lot or something like that, but what we're charged with tonight is to address the rezoning.
That is correct. It is a rezoning request and for, again, just over 1,100 square feet of property. And so the staff report is really built around the rezoning and the transformation of that portion of property to commercial in order to support the commercial node and the commercial property and how that impacts the area.
All right, thank you. Do any of the commission members have any questions for Eric or staff before we move on?
I have just a general question. Did the applicant ever talk to the neighbor to see to have joint parking?
I defer to the applicant for any discussions he had with his neighbor.
Is there any other questions for city staff at this point? Okay. Would someone like to present this case? If you would, please come forward and state your name and address for the record.
Mr. Chairman, Mike Bates, Central Missouri Professional Services, 2500 East McCarty Street. Eric's done a very good job of giving you background information, and we've provided handouts that complement what he has said. I would like to reemphasize, number one, this is just the first step. Number two will be at Board of Adjustment. And then number three, while the plan was shown to demonstrate that a parking lot could be constructed efficiently and used effectively, with the second visual you have, we still have to meet all of the city's requirements in regard to landscaping, buffering, stormwater, etc., as we get into the administrative process of a final plan submittal. So that is truly used to indicate, yes, this can, we can do it. It's practical. Mr. Deerhoff and Patrick Kramer of our office as project engineer, they are both with me here tonight. Be happy to add supporting testimony or answer questions. Mr. Deerhoff began his accounting business in Jefferson City in 1978, rental property on East McCarty Street. Shortly after that, the early 80s, he purchased this property and built the office building. So he's been there since the early 80s. In 1997, he actually purchased the house next door. Eric tells me this may be the smallest rezoning request we've ever submitted. I don't know that that's the case, but there have been some split parcels that might be smaller, but it is very small. And part of the goal here is, if you look at Stadium Boulevard and Southwest Boulevard, they're both arterial streets. While the homes along, in particular, Stadium Boulevard were built in the 50s and the 60s, when those folks built there, they did not anticipate the type of traffic we have today. For instance, 9,000 cars a day on Stadium, 10,000 cars a day on Southwest Boulevard. Actually, Southwest Boulevard, with the construction of the 179 outer loop, has been reduced significantly in traffic. So we were looking, as we began this process with city staff, truly as to how we make lemonade out of lemons. And one of the concerns of city staff was, we typically see on these arterial streets, and Southwest Boulevard is a good example, that over time you transition into commercial because of a lack of interest in people having single-family residence along an arterial street like that. If we were planning the Swifts-Thompson subdivision today, you wouldn't see the fronting lots on Stadium as an arterial street. So in '97, as I said, Mr. Deerhoff purchased the property next door to protect his investment, and we're going through this process, which is several steps, to find a way. His business, if we were doing this today, and not the early 80s, the office building and the parking would not have looked like this. And obviously, you can say hindsight's great, but we have better planning tools now, and that basically will require him to build the parking lot that we're talking about to today's standards. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. We'll be at the Board of Adjustment Tuesday morning, as Eric said, and then if we receive approval, we'll actually begin the process of doing the final design and submittal to the city.
Thank you, Mr. Bates. Do any of the commission members have any questions for Mike or Mr. Deerhoff or Mr. Kramer. Thank you, sir.
You bet.
Next, we'll move on to public testimony. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak in favor of this request? Please come forward and state your name and address for the record. Seeing none. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to speak in opposition to this request? If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record. Seeing none. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak on this request? If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record. Seeing none. At this point, we will close testimony. Eric, we will move on to your staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the Jefferson City Comprehensive Plan essentially identifies this area as a commercial node, at least that portion of it south of Stadium Boulevard. So it's kind of a small commercial node at the intersection of two major streets. The portion of the property proposed for a redesignation on the comprehensive plan is, of course, adjacent to that commercial node, fairly small in nature. And the redesignation of that small area to commercial would be a logical expansion of the commercial node that would not be a major change in the intended use pattern for this area. So the staff recommendation is for approval of the comprehensive plan amendment. And the requested commercial rezoning, very similar in nature, would be a logical expansion of that existing node of commercial zoning located at the intersection of these two roads. The commercial zoning at the rear of the property would not appear to create any major land use conflicts, and the expansion of the commercial node would be a benefit to the adjacent commercial operations, essentially allow a little bit more commercial breathing room within that area. Staff recommends approval of the request to rezone the property from RS4 to CO. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions you may have. The recommended form of motion is in two parts, one for the comprehensive plan amendment and one for the rezoning request.
Thank you, Eric. Do any of the commission members have any questions for Eric or other city staff?
Just curious what the variances are.
So there's 4 variances, 2 dealing with the driveway and 2 dealing with the size and nature, location of the residential portion of the property. So the first variance is that the width of a driveway, a commercial driveway, for two-way traffic must be 24 feet. They are proposing a 12-foot wide driveway. And so essentially a vehicle will only be able to travel one direction at a time. The parking lot is fairly small. And so, it could accommodate that theoretically. So, and the second variance is a setback variance for the driveway. So commercial driveways are required to be set back from property lines by 5 feet. So that gives a little bit of space for a traveling vehicle, not being, right up against a neighboring property. So it's a 5-foot setback requirement, proposing a reduction in that to basically 3 feet. So a 2-foot reduction. The other 2 variances deal with the house. One is a setback requirement, a rear setback, in order to allow for the division of the property. Essentially, the rear setbacks would be reduced. There would be a smaller amount of yard area back behind it in order to divide the commercial portion of the property off. The other is a lot area variance. So the area of the property met the minimum lot size for the RS4 district basically almost exactly, and now an additional 1,100 square feet is being proposed to be moved over to the commercial side. And so it's a variance in order to accommodate that. And those are the 4 variances that would appear before the Board of Adjustment on Tuesday morning.
Is there any other questions for city staff from the commissioners? All right. I see none there. We will move on, and we will entertain a motion when someone is ready.
Move to approve the comprehensive plan amendment request to show the 1,120 square feet property as commercial on the developmental plan map of the comprehensive plan.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. I think, as Eric mentioned, the next step will be for Board of Adjustment for
There's
variances
another
on...
motion.
Second motion for rezoning.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Okay.
We'll do that. Okay.
Move to approve the request to rezone the 1,120 square feet of the property from RS4 to CO.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Now, we will go on to, it gets forwarded to the Board of Adjustment on Tuesday.
Well, so this is independent. The rezoning is independent of the Board of Adjustment action. So the variances that were discussed would appear before the Board of Adjustment on Tuesday morning. Their meeting will take place at 7:30 a.m. in this room. And the rezoning request will proceed from this body, from Planning and Zoning, to the City Council, and with a public hearing in front of that body on December 18th.
Okay.
And that meeting will take place in this room at 6 p.m.
Very good. Thank you. Next, we'll move on to case number P17022. It's a text amendment pertaining to the Historic Preservation Review of Demolition Proposals. Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you mentioned, there was a fair amount of correspondence that we have received on this proposal that's been passed out to you today. So I please encourage you to look over that correspondence as it does pertain to the action that's being requested of you this evening. Consideration of this text amendment pertaining to Historic Preservation Review of Demolition Proposals. This is an amendment, a proposed amendment brought forward by City staff pertaining to actually Chapter 8 of the City Code, Building and Building Regulations, rather than the Zoning Code. So it's a little odd in that respect. The reason that this is being brought forward to the Planning and Zoning Commission is that, you know, the authority granted to a city to regulate this demolition review in this case is largely granted through the zoning sections of Missouri State statute. Ultimately, I'd defer to the law department if there's a need for a more technical explanation of that. But the basis of it is that it is very development oriented, and the Planning and Zoning Commission has been granted a lot of the review rights for development oriented codes, and responsibility for taking public comment and making formal recommendations to the City Council on such things. And so its link with development is fairly strong, and for that reason it has been referred to this body for review. It's also been referred to the Historic Preservation Commission, and being a historic oriented type of code, looking for their recommendation as well, and will be presented to for their recommendation on Tuesday of next week, Tuesday evening. So we've got a lot of meetings next Tuesday. So this item was presented to you briefly at the last meeting, just as a prelude prior to the public hearing, give you an opportunity to get a first glance at it, and an opportunity to think about it over the course of the intervening meetings, and then for this meeting is presented as a public hearing item. So within the packets is essentially two things. One is a staff analysis of what has been drafted, so a 2-page overview of what this code amendment would mean, and then the actual amendment, so which goes on for a number of pages, and some of the language within it is fairly technical. I will attempt to go over some of the major points within it over the next couple slides. First, the intent and goal. And so what is the intent of this this ultimately proposed council bill, this amendment to the city code? And so right now the historic preservation review process for demolition proposals is fairly weak. It requires any structure that is greater than 50 years old to be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission prior to demolition, but does not grant the Historic Preservation Commission any actual authority to prevent that demolition. Their recommendations are just that, recommendations. And it has a timeline built into it, so basically a waiting period that if they find something to be historic or notable, that they can make sure that a certain number of days have to pass before it's demolished. That gives them a little bit of time to perhaps negotiate with the property owner and find a way to save it or salvage some of the historic materials or other actions to perhaps preserve some of that history. So there's a strong desire by the Historic Preservation Commission to have something with more strength in it, and they've been working for very long in terms of getting something in place regarding a stronger process for review of demolition as it pertains to historic structures. Not only them, but also the Historic City of Jefferson, a not-for-profit agency that's unassociated with the city, not a city board or anything, has a strong desire to have something in place stronger than what is on the books right now, and both of those organizations had worked for some time prior to this coming before you, and so this has been in the works literally for many years, and so the what is within the proposal before you is essentially would establish a tiered structure for review of demolition proposals. And so I have 3 bullet points up there. One, for buildings less than 50 years old, that there would be no review process. And so, again, 50 years is the mark that's within the city code today. And then buildings between 50 and 100 years old, keeping the current review process that's in place today applicable for that spread of building ages. And so any building that's between 50 and 100 years old would still have to go in front of the Historic Preservation Commission for a review process. But ultimately, the commission would not have the ability to prevent that demolition. They'd merely have the ability to stretch out the time a little. And then the third bullet point there, for buildings greater than 100 years old, establish a new process wherein the commission would have the ability to deny a demolition permit based on findings of historic significance. And then there's some other processes built into that as well, which I'll get to through the course of the presentation. So the 2 key terms that I need to point out here, number 1 and number 2 up on the screen, they read very similar, but basically refer to them as the 2 underlined words there. One is a review process, that process applicable for structures between 50 and 100 years old. The other is a clearance process. So think of it almost like a permit. A clearance permit that would be issued by the Historic Preservation Commission prior to authorizing demolition of a structure. And so that clearance process, for number 2, would be applicable again to buildings over 100 years old, and also buildings located within a local historic district. It's a fairly common type of regulation when we were researching this, looking at other communities and how they regulate such things, that a lot of their demolition ordinances are built around local historic districts and regulating demolition within those. In Jefferson City, we have no locally designated historic districts. We have a number of National Register districts. And when people say historic districts, that's often what they mean is a National Register district. But there is language within the city code today to establish a local historic district. It's just never been acted upon. And so, retreating back up to number 1 there, the Historic Preservation Demolition Review process, again, applicable to structures between 50 and 100 years old, but also to local landmarks. There is a process for designating historic landmarks, although the historic nature is not the only reason to designate a landmark. But landmarks would have to go through a review process if proposed for demolition, and then also any property located within a National Register district. Again, one of those existing national historic districts that there are several within our community. And so that's the point of the slide, is to differentiate between the review process and the clearance process, with the clearance process being, again, almost like a permit. To kind of further refine on that, the review process would be review only. It could not actually prevent the issuance of a demolition permit. It would have a timeline, basically 75 days that would accommodate the ability of the Historic Preservation Commission to talk about it at two meetings, two of their monthly meetings. If they were to deny it, the action would be for city staff would not be able to issue the demolition permit until the expiration of that 75-day period as measured from the date their application was made. And the last note there is really to differentiate it from the next slide, is that there's no public hearing process associated with this review process or notification to surrounding property owners or anything to that effect. So the next slide, the clearance process, again, the one more targeted toward almost being a permit. Applicable to properties over 100 years old or located within the local historic district. The approval or denial of that clearance, if denied, the demolition permit cannot be issued. Okay? There would be a public hearing before bringing proposals to, for demolition clearance before the Historic Preservation Commission. Also a signposting on the property. So it'd be somewhat similar to, say, a rezoning action, the public process that we go through prior to a rezoning. It would not include mailing to surrounding property owners, but it would be posting a sign on the property. So the signs are usually pretty good at getting people's attention. The timeline would basically be the same timeline that's associated with rezoning proposals. So in front of this body, if someone's proposing a rezoning, the commission really has a responsibility to act on that matter at that meeting, or to postpone it to the next meeting for cause. The applicant has the ability to postpone an application by one meeting for cause. And so, barring those two things both happening, a 3-month timeline is really the maximum stretch that a typical application would see before having to have some kind of action on it. Again, unless it was continued for a very good cause. Denials by the Historic Preservation Commission could be appealed to the City Council, again with a public hearing in front of that body as well. So if someone was proposing a demolition of a structure over 100 years old and needed clearance, they would go in front of the Historic Preservation Commission. If denied, they would go on to the city, they could appeal to the City Council, and again, a public hearing in front of that body as well for a final determination. If approved by the Historic Preservation Commission, city staff would then be able to issue a demolition permit. If approved either by the Historic Preservation Commission or by the City Council upon appeal. Yep. And so within the proposed ordinance amendment, there is review criteria. And of course, it's important to lay out some criteria as to how these things are going to be viewed and processed by the Historic Preservation Commission in this case, and the City Council after them. So the review criteria is very important, and essentially it's kind of a tiered structure. So I have a line there in the middle of the slide dividing the top from the bottom. So the top is really focused on what makes the structure historic. And so National Register nominations have a set of criteria, and I didn't want to list them all. They're listed within the ordinance. Section G1. Items A through I. So what is that? 9 different criteria. Essentially, basically the same as what would be reviewed if proposed for National Register nomination. And so that's the first bullet point there, is establishing that criteria as a way to determine if a structure is historic. Then also, the second bullet point, criteria relating to the visual impact on streetscapes or other historic properties. And so that's number 2 under item G. whether a structure is notable with respect to being, associated with the spatial or visual relationship of other landmarks or other historic properties. The loss of a building within a historic streetscape would, is noteworthy and an item for review, or a building that's located right next to a very historic building. And then below the line there, back up. So those two items, the top two bullet points, would essentially be the review criteria to determine if a structure is, historic or notable. Okay, if it's a notable structure, if it's found to be a notable structure, then the bottom set of review criteria would come into consideration, and that's whether what the state of deterioration of the structure is. Whether it's located within an area designated as redevelopment area within the city's plans, the nature of the surrounding land use, if it's kind of in conflict with the surrounding land use, if there's the number of other similar structures located within the community, which is basically one of the existing criteria, and any plans for preservation of fixtures or elements when. These criteria are really meant to, if a structure is found historic, but also for one of these reasons, there's a necessity for demolition, then it's that's kind of the way that that would be reviewed by again Historic Preservation Commission and City Council in order to kind of really to get at it is a structure could be historic and also approved for demolition because it meets both the top and the bottom criteria, that it's historic and also either deteriorated or located within an area that is a redevelopment area or et cetera. The bottom item there, preservation of fixtures and elements. If a structure is to be demolished, there's often a strong desire to try to preserve anything that can be preserved, stairways, with various fixtures that are located within the structure, and so what the property owner, what their plans are in terms of preserving that, or lack of preservation, is an item for consideration by the Historic Preservation Commission as proposed. Various other items amend the application fees, so there'd be an application fee structure established with it. The length of approval, which really is probably most notable or applicable to the clearance process, being as it's kind of a permit, would be 1 year. So that would allow for a property owner to apply for demolition clearance prior to putting all their plans in place to actually demolish the structure, so they could get their historic preservation clearance prior to moving forward with a larger redevelopment plan or something. It gives them some ability to time things, and also the ability for property to transfer. If a owner is interested in the property but not the structure, then you could very easily see that this clearance process is something that would have to be accommodated before the transfer of a property. And then conditions on approval. The proposed ordinance would allow for the Historic Preservation Commission to place conditions on approval of a demolition clearance, and would allow for the person seeking that clearance to appeal those conditions to the City Council. That's what I have in terms of a presentation to you. I think the only thing left would be the staff recommendation, but I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions.
How is the age of the house going to be determined?
It can be through a variety of different means. Cole County has a lot of age information on file as part of some of their assessment records, but that's not.
I know for a fact that some houses were built a lot earlier than what the assessor says they're built. So, I mean, there's going to be almost an arbitrary way of deciding how old the property is unless they do a thorough abstract search or what type of building materials. I know cut stone can give you an age, a type of brick can give you an age.
Yep. And so there's no set way on determining the age of a structure, or at least nothing that would be inserted into the code.
The Historic Commission is on board with this?
I believe that's their determination to make on Tuesday. So.
I'm surprised that they allow the 50 to 100 years. That's so arbitrary. We'll tear down all our houses. I mean, all of them, put up Butler buildings. I mean, because we only have a few hundred years. And there's no teeth in it. I think we should have a review process for anything 75 years, 50 to 75 years. We can go, is this the time to complain? Well, in my mind, you could go and tear out large sections of Hazleton and put up a big house, large sections of Moreland, put up a big house. They'll definitely not meet the 100-year-old house. I mean, it's just, we're going to destroy our city if we allow just willy-nilly, 50 years old, 100 years old, all right, we'll just tear it down. I mean, to me, it's no different than we've ever had. I think there ought to be some really harsh penalties for tearing them down, and you have to get a review process. And I've been on this commission for 12, 13 years, and I've been a strong proponent of personal rights, property rights. But my gosh, when you come in the city, you give up rights. And for this one, I think my house is over 100 years old. I don't want anybody telling me what to do, but I don't want this city torn down any more than I've seen it torn down, especially what they did. Well, I'll be quiet now.
Okay. Is there any other questions for Eric from the commission members at this point?
Eric, on most of the communication, it addresses a couple of different things. One seems to be the penalty, which you've put at $500, and it's recommending a higher penalty. And certainly, I know with some of the problems we have in the city that it seems to me penalties haven't been strict enough to have compliance. So I was wondering why you're set at 500 rather than a higher penalty in this.
And so it's, again, I'd probably defer to the law department. They're probably the expert. They are the experts on the penalty sections of the city code. The $500 is basically the same as a general ordinance violation. So it's actually not setting it at 500. It's calling it a general ordinance violation, and so be applicable the same penalty as any other general ordinance violation. So it's not differentiating it from any other section of the city code as proposed.
All right.
So.
I don't think Michael's done. Are you done, sir?
So it could be set higher.
As I understand it, yes. Yeah.
Michael, the general ordinance violation penalties range from $1 all the way up to $1,000, so it can fit anywhere within that range.
So basically setting it higher at 950 is not a problem.
Can you give me just 1 second here?
Michael, what section is that in that you're referencing?
We'll look that up just to give some clarity to you, but I'd be happy to answer any other questions. And certainly a lot of the public comments are targeted in that, both toward the comments that have been received and passed out to you in the correspondence packet are targeted not only toward the year range, be it 100 years or 75 or 50, but also toward that penalty section. The intent of city staff was that it to be a general ordinance violation, and just going to try to clarify that that's what it is and what those dollar amounts are.
Oh, okay, but you're right. The other major comment was rather than 100 years to be 75 for that, and so my question is why is it 100 rather than 75?
It could be set at any year. That was an item of a lot of discussion as last presented to the city council and actually the Public Works and Planning Committee, as the staff would be proposing it as 100 year based on their direction.
Michael, what section is that fee in? Did you ever find it? Sorry to be a pain, I'm not seeing it either.
So it's where it talks about the penalty.
I never saw it either.
So Eric, where's the penalty mentioned?
I was going to let Brian has, I think, some better information. I believe I may have
What section is it
misspoke.
referenced in? I want to know where it's at. Where is it? What section is it referenced in the ordinance you have tonight?
It's not, Mr. Chairman, because it's already in effect. The
Oh,
Chapter 8
that's what-
penalty provisions is found in Section 837 of the City Code, and it applies to any violations of the Building Code, Chapter 8, which would include wrongful demolition or unlawful demolition, if you will. The penalty is not considered a general ordinance violation pursuant to Section 113, but it is specified at a fine of up to $500 or up to 180 days imprisonment, or both.
So I did misspeak. It's not a general ordinance violation. It is a typical Chapter 8 violation, as would be applicable to anything else contained within Chapter 8 building and building regulations.
So the penalty is not under discussion today. That's not what's in front of us here, so that's kind of off the table as far as discussion, correct?
Not necessarily, no. There are a number of comments that I believe the comments are that it should be higher. It could be written to have a different penalty than what is outlined within the, for the rest of Chapter 8. It would probably need to come with some kind of justification as to how it is differentiated between, this historic demolition or other, areas of building code violations. But it is a possibility to establish a higher violation for a specific section of the code.
I would love to see that happen. I think they ought to pull the building permit if they tear it down. Or are we going to be like Columbia, have all these laws, but they don't enforce them? That's why they have, that's why they have problems there. I can see them just start, I'll pay my $1,000, tear it down, put something else anyway. Tear down the 100-year-old house, pay my $1,000 and be done with it. I mean, it just...
Well, there is
Why?
a possibility of 180 days in jail, too.
Well, yeah, but still, they're not going to do that. All the contractors are known here in town.
I guess
Yes.
also the definition of demolition sort of suggests that there's an active demolition of actually applying for a permit and demolishing something, but then it also says that sort of if something falls into disrepair, that can be demolition as well. It's in that 832 under A, permit required. But then the rest of the process seems to only apply to the active demolition. Is there a reason why we refer to it being a violation as letting something fall into disrepair in this section? Is that not addressed elsewhere, or?
It's actually addressed in the nuisance code, the property maintenance code, and the building code all together. So you've got Chapter 21 and Chapter 8 kind of all working together, and that gives us the teeth to go after those as well.
Okay, so is there anything in the review process that really applies to the disrepair?
Yes. It's part of the criteria. I'm the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission. What you're referring to is...
Sir, let me stop you. We're not to the point where you can speak. I don't mean to... We have a procedure we need to go through, so thank you. If city staff or the city attorney can answer it, we'll go that. We'll give you an opportunity.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, I guess my question really is, what's the relationship of the passive demolition, so letting something fall into disrepair, and the actual review process that we're talking about today? What's that relationship?
Any thoughts on that? So
as you said, Blake, it does meet the definition of demolition as listed there in Section A. So, yeah, we would be able to use this permit to demolish language and impose the penalty against them for doing that. But, I mean, what else can we do? As far as abatement and city abatement, we take care of that under Chapter 21, not under this provision, whereas the city can go in and stabilize or make repairs. That's under the public nuisance provisions.
Yeah. Well, I guess my question is just, can you force somebody into this review process because of their failure to maintain or repair their building? It seems... I'm not sure if the language really says that, but the definition kind of makes it seem that way. I'm just curious. And then who would be the person who even pushes somebody into that process? Would it be the Historic Commission? Would it be a neighbor, somebody else?
Sure, I agree with you, Blake. There's no involuntary application process written into here, but the definition itself is somewhat problematic.
I think a lot of that language is carried over from what's on the books right now, and so that's why it's there.
Is there any other questions at this point?
As proposed, a person who applied for demolition clearance and, let's say, was approved, okay, and so they received their demolition clearance from Historic Preservation, okay, that clearance would be in effect for 1 year. Yeah. So if they basically have 1 year to apply for a demolition permit, okay, and then if they apply for a demolition permit after that 1 year is expired, they would have to go through the clearance process again. So, and I believe it's written that it would be applicable to the review process as well. And so again, that gives people the ability to go through historic preservation prior to putting demolition plans in order, or maybe even transferring the property, or putting together a site plan for redevelopment, or whatever is the ultimate end goal for the property.
Would that clearance be transferable from one owner to another?
Yes, it would just apply to the property or the structure, I guess it would be. And so, yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it would, be this clearance process would be separate from the actual issuance of a demolition permit, is so that it could be accommodated before the transfer of a property, or many other reasons.
Okay, thank you.
So in the current process, how do we go about making the penalty more severe? You said it can be done.
Yeah.
Michael, in the current process, we would have to include the penalty provision 837, either change the penalty range for a Chapter 8 violation and make all Chapter 8 violations essentially general code violations, that is, up to $1,000 or up to 180 days. The max fine we can impose on any sort of city violation is $1,000 or 180 days. We can't go beyond that by Missouri Constitution. But we can either apply this to all of Chapter 8, or we could carve out a special niche and add it to here, where a penalty for unlawful demolition would be, as you would suggest, up to $1,000 or 180 days imprisonment. Kind of two ways you can get there.
Do we have any statistics on home demolitions? How many home demolitions we have per year as far as historic goes? Do we have an issue with that now?
I'm going to give you a rough estimate. I will say since 2011, approximately 6 demolition applications have been recommended for denial by the Historic Preservation Commission. As for, I believe last year we had 18 demolition applications that were reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission. I will say that number is lower this year. And I believe, so that was 2016 with 18 demolition applications. 2015, I want to say that there was approximately 10 to 15 demolition applications. Does that answer for you?
Yeah, and are they, a majority of them historical, considered in this range?
Well, in order for it to be sent to the Historic Preservation Commission, and I'm sorry, I didn't specify that. I am the liaison to the Historic Preservation Commission. So those figures that I gave you were for the 50 years or older range. Mm-hmm.
So roughly 15 to 20 a year, and about 6 of them over the course of since 2011 have been recommended for denial. Although I think there is many, and probably defer to the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission who's in attendance this evening, that may have been kind of borderline in terms of their history. So.
Okay, is there any other questions from commission members this evening for any of the city staff that's here tonight? Okay. If not, we will move on. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak in favor of this request? If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record, please. Eric, refresh me. I'm not trying to cut anyone short. I do know we have some folks in the audience. Our typical time frame for someone to speak is 3 minutes?
Is 3 minutes, not including questions by the commission.
Please proceed if you state your name and address for the record, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tammy Beshin, and I live at 728 Deer Creek Road, and I represent the historic city of Jefferson as the president. As you know, it was our organization that got the ball rolling for this ordinance back in 2014. Since then, this ordinance has been researched and scrutinized by several groups and individuals. Jefferson City has a long and interesting past, but many wonderful buildings that reflect this have already been lost, and remaining buildings that most remind us of our forefathers are presently not protected. There are various aspects to the present ordinance draft, most of which we agree with, which is stated in my letter dated of November 2nd that you should have in your possession. Most importantly is the right of the Historic Preservation Commission to deny a demolition permit in the interest of community heritage. There are 2 points, however, that we continue to have concerns about, and they've already been discussed a little bit here tonight. I just kind of like to draw your attention to those. First is the 2 categories: the Historic Preservation Demolition Review, which is currently being done for buildings 50 years and older, versus the Historic Preservation Demolition Clearance being recommended for buildings 100 years and older. And it is this latter category in which demolition could be denied if the building fits the specified criteria with due process for appeal. According to statistics shared recently during a presentation by the city, Jefferson City has about 13,200 single-family or light residential properties. The proposal of clearance for buildings 100 years and older would only affect about 5% of these structures, or roughly 750 out of about 13,000 properties. However, this threshold would not protect many of the wonderful homes built in the 1920s, which we're coming up to, especially along Adams Street, Morrow Drive, West Main, Elmerine Avenue, and even some along Swift's highways, just to name some of the more prominent areas, older areas in our city. And so do we want to lose these structures? We would like to suggest, as my letter has said, the age be raised to 75 years or newer. And that has also been kind of noted that we need to have some kind of a process, a clear-cut process in place to determine the true age of a building, because there's apparently several errors in some of the documents that are being used today. Please note, in reality, we're talking about a very small percentage of demolition permits that would potentially be denied, but those buildings deserve a deeper review and the opportunity to remain standing for future generations. Secondly, the fine, as kind of talked about, the $500 is kind of a drop in the bucket to some developers. We'd really like to see that raised to up to $1,000. To be more of a deterrent for would-be defenders. The community and our leaders are starting to realize and understand the value of retaining our interesting and culturally important structures economically, historically, and aesthetically. Many other communities, cities, and towns already have preservation ordinances with teeth on their books, and they've had them for years. And it has been proven that today's younger population is gravitating to older districts, so that would also help our city grow. Acceptance of a historic preservation ordinance in this, the capital city, would show that our past truly matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Appreciate that. If you'd stay for just a second, we'll ask the commission members if they have any questions for you.
Right. Right now, according to those statistics, there's about 13,200 single-family or light residential units, and it has been specified that 753 of those, at the time of those statistics, were 100 years or older, and that translates to only 5% of those structures. It's about 20% instead of 5% at 75 years and older. And then I think it's about around 40 to maybe 45% if you're looking at 50% or 50 years and older. And I could be corrected by the city.
Is there any other questions for Tammy at this point? Jack?
Are you comfortable with the ordinance the way it's written?
Mostly.
Okay. Other than the teeth, I mean the penalties and the age and the criteria for aging the houses?
Yeah, those are our main concerns with it. That's kind of a tricky question because we have fought so hard to get something in place. It's not a perfect ordinance, of course, and of course no ordinance is, but it is something. We'd really like to see those, specifically those two changes to it, the penalty and the age that's being considered for clearance are probably the two things that we would most likely like to see changed.
Any other questions for Tammy? Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may clarify how the age of a structure is determined. The city staff would take any information regarding how, when a structure is constructed, and in terms of determining its age. The Historic Preservation Commission, could certainly provide information, in terms of the age of a structure, anything that's appearing in front of them. So, we have heard a lot of concern about simply using the online GIS system and the year date entry into that spreadsheet, and that's not necessarily the only thing that's looked at. It is the easiest to look at, the most accessible and available, and sometimes it's the only information that we can find. But certainly any information that determines the age of a structure, probably wouldn't feel comfortable putting how an age of a structure is determined within the city code, because there's always going to be other information that that could become available, and so it is largely the act of historians that determine those structures. So hopefully in the future we'll have better databases on when these structures are constructed, and but even then, likely we would be looking at any information available in order to come up with a more accurate year. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to come forward and speak in favor of this request? If so, please come forward and give your name and address for the record.
I'm Paul Graham, 1507 Greenberry Road. I'm on the historic, or a member of the historic city of Jefferson. I'm also on the foundation, and I wrote the first two drafts of the ordinance that's before you several years ago. It was loaded with teeth at that time. Loaded with teeth. I'm reminded 50 years ago I worked in a meat packing plant, and I made sausage, among other things, and the Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, once said there's two things you don't want to see. One is one is sausage, and the other is the law. And this process has been a learning experience for me in that regard. Those propositions are true. I would like to see this ordinance go forward as is. There are many things about it I don't like. There are many things about it that I would like to see improved. I would like to see it have a lot more teeth in it. We had many, many meetings with folks around the community here and ended up pulling out all sorts of teeth to make the thing more palatable to other people. I appreciate the great patience. Here we are 3.5 years later having a very sincere and very passionate conversation about the same thing. And what I'm picking up here is the attitude of people want this somehow to work if we can just figure out a way to do it. And everybody raises their hand and they say, what about this, and why did you do this, and why did you do that? Well, there's going to be somebody that's got an answer to that question, and every one of those questions that's already spoken up in the past. And what you've got here is a lot of work that this guy right over here did. Thank goodness he was around. I got tired and tossed the ball off, and he turned this thing, Mr. Hernandez did, for the record here, took the ball, and I think he's gotten it awfully close to the finish line with his work on this. And not to praise him too much or anybody else, the point is there's a whole lot of people that worked on this, and that doesn't mean that you should pass it on through because a whole lot of people have worked on it. It means that there's probably nothing that we can do at this level of government that is going to incite more aggravation, anger, outbursts, high fines, low fines, go this way, go that way, than property rights. You're going to tell me what I can do with my property? I don't think so. If you want to get people going, this is an example of how to get them going. And yet here we are, and we've got something that's pretty good. Not something that's perfect or ever going to be perfect. We're in a democracy. We're never going to get it right, but we're going to get it close. So I don't know that you've got any questions for me, because all I've done is blathered on here about the process, but a lot of people have worked on this thing, and I think they've got something that will really help us make Jefferson City proud in the future. Because at the end of the day, folks, what you've got that you've never had before here is the capacity to say no. And we don't have an ordinance now that allows us to say no. And in a community as historic and as proud of its past and as anxious and passionate about protecting its past for its future as we are, we really ought to have at least the ability to say no when somebody wants to tear something down. This ordinance does that. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. Does anyone have any questions for Paul at this point? Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to speak in favor of this request? If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record. Okay, we will move on. Is there anyone who would like to speak in opposition to this request? Please come forward and state your name and address for the record. I'm seeing none. Is there anyone who would like to speak on this request? Please come forward and state your name and address for the record.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Art Hernandez, 1616 Bunker Hill Road. I am the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, and gratefully, I have been the chair for the past 2 years. So, about 2 terms or 2 meetings prior to my election for chair, this proposal was initially brought to the commission. I would really like you all to take a look at the original ordinance, which is online. I don't say that to delay the process. And I didn't remain neutral to delay the process. I'm in favor of this ordinance moving forward. My concern, again, is the 50 years. My concern, again, is the penalty. Our initial proposal was that it'd be 50 years, and I'm going to get into that because I think it's a lot more detailed in that situation. But as far as penalties are concerned, our initial proposal was that it be treated as a Class A misdemeanor in the criminal system. So it would be a $1,000 fine or up to a year in jail. And I understand we said that without any reference to the legal department. And as I've explained to staff that is present here today and other members, the current staff, with the exception of Jamie, and this doesn't apply to Jamie, dropped the ball in talking to us and working with us to get this ordinance to you. That's really why it's taken 2.5 years. We've approved a proposed ordinance to be taken to various boards, city council, for 2.5 years. This is the 3rd iteration of that. They have all had the 50-year mark because that's what we've been working with, at least since I've been on the commission, and for my prior commissioners since the commission was established over 20 years ago. If the proposal goes forward as is, or the ordinance goes forward as proposed, ultimately becomes law, it does a lot of good for a lot of things here in Jeff City. My job as commission chair and the other commissioners is to protect the historic buildings and structures of this town. I ask you to think about this. In the early 1900s, there was a fire at the state capitol, and it burned to the ground, and it had to be rebuilt. That was around 100 years ago. What if that building had burned in 1975? What if the J.C. riot from the prison had burned and passed over to the Capitol, and it burned, and it was less than 50 years old? And I use this only as an example, not as a concrete example, but just a general thought. If that building was less than 50 years old, we would have no say in it, which is what is standard today by the State Historic Preservation Commission and other national and local laws. But if this ordinance were to pass and the Missouri State Capitol were just a regular building with no historic value, no national or state historic value, and it came before my commission, and this ordinance was in place, if the legislators came to me and said, hey, Art, we're going to tear down the building because we just want to tear it down, I would be stuck in the same position that I am today. I can say no, and they could still tear it down because it's between 50 and 100 years old. This current ordinance, and this is my own personal complaint, is that it doesn't change anything for those buildings between 50 and 100, and there are not a lot of them that are historic. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the chance to speak about them. And I think that staff misspeaks when they say that we have the authority to approve or to disapprove. That was never our intent when this ordinance came to us. It was to make a recommendation to City Council, who is responsible to the electorate and to the people who voted them in, to make the final decision. That if they didn't approve our recommendation of denial, that City Council would make the final decision, and then there would be an appeal process through the judicial system. That was the entire purpose of our review. It's not for me and my other 8 commissioners to say, you can't tear down your structure, because we're not elected. It was to make the recommendation to them that we don't think it should be demolished, and then let them deal with City Council, and City Council listen to me. Because of that, and I know that my time is up, I appreciate your time, and I thank you. And as most of you know, that I'm available to speak, not just tonight, but at any time about this position.
Thank you, Art. I think we all can understand your passion here this evening. With that being said, I'll ask the commission members if they have any questions for you at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to come forward and speak on this request? Seeing none at this time, I will close testimony. Eric, I will turn it back over to you for your staff report.
Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, just the staff recommendation is for approval of the proposed text amendment. Be happy to answer any other questions that come up either directly or through discussion. The recommendation is to approve as drafted with no modifications. And there is, of course, with something as complex as this ordinance, the ability to have multiple recommendations for changes within it, would respectfully request that any proposals for amendment or modification be made separate from the motion to approve the thing moving forward. Really, what I'm getting at is to have an initial motion on the floor to approve it, and then discuss any modifications separately from that. With that, be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Do any of the commission members have any questions for Eric? And I'll open it up to other city staff at this point, so we'll entertain any questions from them. Okay, seeing none with that, would someone like to make a motion? I think what Eric just explained is he would like to see the motion first. Whether that is approved or denied, we will vote on that, and then we will move on if there's any amendments that would like to be brought up.
Not necessarily to vote on it, but to get the motion out there, and then if members want to make motions to amend what is on the floor, then or you can do it the other way around and start amending the document, and then when it's in its final form, vote for approve. Really,
are you I guess really we probably should have the amendments in there, because otherwise you'd be approving it as is. And what's the law department like?
That's you put the motion on the floor first. Under Robert's rules, the motion's there, and then once it's offered and seconded, you begin discussion, and the amendment process is part of that discussion process. You can start stacking on amendments there, kind of like a car dealer does when you go to buy a car and they throw in all this other stuff on there.
Okay. So with that being said, I think we've been set off in a direction. So if someone would like to make a motion, we'll get a second, and then we will work through any amendments that we would like to deal with.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the city code text amendment pertaining to historic preservation review of demolition proposals.
We have a motion and a second. At this point, we will open up for discussion and/or amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to amend the present ordinance to not 100 years to 75 years. And can I put 2 amendments on there?
Let's do one at a
Do one
time.
To amend it to make it at least 75 years and not the present 100 years.
So I'm assuming at this point you want us to, you need a second for that?
Yes, the amendments will have to have a second, and then there's discussion allowed on that specific amendment, and then vote.
Then you vote on that amendment.
Correct.
Okay.
I'll second that amendment.
So we have a motion and a second on the amendment, changing the years from 100 to 75. At the advice of the city attorney, we will now open that up for discussion.
I would like to ask J.D. how many meetings have been involved in coming up with these years?
Literally 3.5 years worth.
I mean, to determine the value of the years that have been, set up for.
They said they'd always had 50 years. It was just recently they stuck at the 75 because of a lot of
Yes,
too much
so
pressure. It always been 50 years before. I'm just having meeting in the middle.
So as Mr. Deacon, I would agree with his statement there. As Mr. Hernandez explained during his testimony up there, is that they had it at 50 years based off of comments received from the public, because this demolition ordinance, I believe, has gone to comments at least once, if not twice. And based off of the comments from the public, it was at that time, it's gone under 3 revisions, and at that time, it was when Eric Barron stepped in and has drafted the current ordinance in its current form. So there has been lots of discussion about the age, and I will, not to speak for the Historic Preservation Commission, but as Mr. Hernandez alluded, that they were not thrilled with the 100 years. I will say that.
I would just like to voice my opinion on that. My preference would be for 100 years, but I think 50 years is unreasonable, so I'm fine with a compromise of 75. I think 100 would be better, but I can see the other side.
I might ask this question of city staff. Pursuant to your statements, you've said this has been 3 years of discussions and compromise and teeth being removed. But in your feeling, do you believe that the ordinance before this commission tonight more represents what the constituents of Jefferson City would like to see, and therefore this commission ought to give that some consideration, even though we all have personal preferences, and everybody sometimes likes to meet in the middle? But I just want to bring something forth to vote on here, that one is, once it leaves here, it does represent what the citizens of Jefferson City would like, as well as when it gets up to our higher powers, also has an opportunity to start an ordinance that gives the commission some teeth back, and not to say that it's perfect, and we can work on that going forward. So I'm trying to play the middle ground here.
I will say, as my opinion, as the liaison to the Historic Preservation Commission, and based off the last 3.5 years, it was at 50 years originally, and based off the comments we received, was, paraphrasing, you're telling me that ranch-style houses are historic, hence I believe is why Eric went with the 100 years. But as comments from the public at this round, as Ms. Beshen up here alluded to, properties on El Marine Street would not meet the 100 years. Properties on Laurel Drive, which is in the National Register, listing of a historic district would not meet the 100-year threshold. So I do think, personally, that the 75 years is a good compromise.
Is there any other comments or questions from the commissioners at this point regarding the amendment? If not, we have a motion and a second, so at some point we will just vote, I assume. Is that correct, Counselor? We have a motion and a second on this amendment to move it from 100 to 75. So if
That's correct. You have an amendment and a second to it, so if discussion is closed on that, then a vote would be appropriate.
Okay. With that advice, is there any other comments?
So after voting on this, then we do another amendment?
Yes.
You can do as many as you want after this.
I would just add one comment, though, that we should understand that we're setting these ages. In 10 years, those houses that were mentioned, they will be 100 years old. So this thing that we're doing here is not just for today. We're going to be living with this for decades. So in just 10 short years, those houses on El Marine and that, they will fall under the 100-year-old thing. So that's just something to consider.
But there again, the developer could come in and say, I'm going to take out 6 of them and build one big house, and then it's gone. So I think they should be stopped. I hate it when somebody tells me what to do. I mean, my voting record shows that, but when we live in the city, we give up rights. We have expectations that certain things are going to happen in the city, from the way it's going to look to how much trash is going to be in the yard and how much burning you can do. I think I think 75 years is, 75 years is good for me.
Mr. Chair, the question of the number of structures based on years had come up, and if you give me just a moment, I think I can display some information on the screen to give the commission members a bit of an idea on how many structures the different year ranges would apply to. If you give me just a moment. The mouse is...
pull that up fairly quick.
Yeah, the mouse is a little slow. It runs a little slow at this distance from the... So up on the screen is some information that was presented in a city council work session on the topic. And so it is divided into different areas, and I would really prefer, for the purposes of this discussion, we're really proposing a citywide ordinance. So it's the bottom row that we're really speaking of. It gives a total number of 13,200 roughly. Now these are structures that have ages, and they're using the date range that Mr. Deacon is so fond of, identified within this the Cole County Assessor's records. Mr. Deacon had mentioned it doesn't necessarily trust, but it's using those date ranges to get an idea. And so they don't have dates established for most of the commercial buildings in town. So it's really the residential ones that we're talking about here. But it's probably good for general discussion purposes. 13,200 total of those structures within the city. If speaking about the number of structures, between 75 and 100 years old, that's 2,000, and then over 100, 753. And so roughly, 27 or almost 2,800 structures that it would be applicable to if set at 75 years. If set at 50 years, 6,300, so a little bit less than half. And so that is a concern, I believe, by other people throughout the community, is that this is a fairly, this is a regulation that's, a process that's being established that property owners would have to comply with, whether they felt their property was historic or not. And so a comment that we do receive is, what is historic about that? Why do I have to do this? And so lowering that year level to a lower amount might bring more of those properties at the general public. Does not feel is notable or historic into this requirement of having to obtain clearance in order to proceed with the demolition. And so that is the reverse argument to what's presented within the packet, which is largely supports for moving that year range down. I have no opinion as a staff member, but it is a comment that we received from other bodies that 50 years is low. Of course, it depends who the comment is coming from and what their thoughts are on the subject. Thank goodness there's people like you to judge all these comments and make formal recommendations to the City Council on what that year level should be. So,
Thank you, Eric. Is there any other discussions regarding the amendment of changing the year range from 100 to 75? Okay, seeing none, I think we all realize this is kind of a heated topic, so we are going to do roll call.
Jack Deacon.
Yes?
Dean Dutoy.
Aye.
Bob George.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Michael Lester.
Yes.
Dale Vaughn.
Yes.
Bunny Tricky Cotton.
Yay.
Blake Marcus.
Aye.
Matthew Hall.
Aye.
Okay. It is 7. It is 7 aye votes and 1 nay vote.
So the motion carries. So the amendment will be change the ordinance from 100 years to 75.
Yes, as it proceeds to the City Council with that recommendation.
Okay? Is there any other amendments we'd like to propose this evening?
I would propose an amendment to place the penalty at, instead of $500, $950 for non-compliance.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second to change the penalty from $500 to $950.
If I may interpret that motion to mean incorporate a section within this ordinance to establish a penalty section setting it at $950.
Yes, because my understanding is the other way is, well, there is another way to do it, but we're talking about doing this specific to this compliance with this section.
So just
So I think-
for this historic review of demolition and penalties associated with it.
Yes.
I have a question for the legal counsel. If this passes, does that eliminate the 180 days in jail? Because he only said establish a penalty of $500, and he said nothing about the jail time.
That's correct. What Mr. Lester's amendment would do is create a specific penalty provision, presumably in Section 842, that applies specifically, solely, only to unlawful demolition.
Okay, so the way he
It's not
worded
going to
it-
change the language in 837 that applies to other violations of Chapter 8 of the Building Code.
So I'm not sure I understand your answer. If this goes forward as motioned and seconded, would there be the jail penalty in there, or did we just wipe it out?
No jail penalty. Specific always trumps the general.
Okay, so if you intended to leave that jail penalty in there, you have to say that.
You have an amendment that's been made and seconded. You can amend the amendment with another amendment.
I'll amend your amendment.
I think he has to amend his own amendment, does he not?
Yes.
Thank you.
So but you probably would. Can I make a suggestion to your amendment? Up to $950 and up to 180 days in jails versus I mean, to be decided upon. I mean, otherwise you're,
Mr. Lester, one suggestion,
Yeah.
just a suggestion here. You could make your amendment to have the penalty provision here considered a general ordinance violation. The range of penalty in that case is up to $1,000 or up to 180 days imprisonment.
Thank you.
But that's already in the code now, right?
No. Again, I had misspoke, saying that that was the intent. What's in the code now is the $500 violation for anything within the building code chapter of the city code. So it's $500 for anything within Chapter 8. This is an amendment to Chapter 8. A general ordinance violation is contained in a separate section of the city code. I believe it's Chapter 1. Yep, 113. And so it would redirect penalties for this demolition, unlawful demolition, to that section. And there's a few other, I think, sections of the city code that do the same thing. This would just be another one that does that. I believe the action would be for Mr. Lester to withdraw his motion and restate it and resecond it.
So I will withdraw my motion,
Fair enough.
and now I'll make an amendment to place the violation of these rules within the general ordinance violation of the city for those penalties up to $1,000 and up to 180 days in jail.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. I'm not going to try to restate your amendment. We have it on record. With that being said, is there any discussion from the commission members? Seeing none, we will move on and we'll go to roll call.
Can you give me just a second,
Yeah.
please?
Give city staff just a minute here.
Okay, Jack Deacon,
Aye.
Dean Dutoy,
Aye.
Bob George,
Aye.
Michael Lester,
Aye.
Dale Vaughn,
Aye.
Bunny Tricky Cotton,
aye.
Blake Marcus,
Aye.
Matthew Hall,
Aye.
and that passes 8-0.
Okay. Right. As Jack mentioned, we still have the ordinance on the floor. Is there any other amendments that the commissioners would like to propose this evening? So we have a motion and a second for the ordinance. Is there any discussion at this point? Okay, we are going to do roll call.
Okay, Jack Deacon,
Aye.
Dean Dutoy,
Aye.
Bob George,
Aye.
Michael Lester,
Aye.
Dale Vaughn,
Aye.
Bunny Tricky Cotton,
Nay.
Blake Marcus,
Aye.
Matthew Hall.
Aye.
Okay, and that passes 7-1.
Motion carries 7-1. The amendments, Eric, city staff will insert the amendments into the ordinance, I'm assuming?
That's correct. We'll insert the amendments by the Planning and Zoning Commission into the ordinance and proceed to the City Council with the Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendation for approval of the amended ordinance.
Okay. When will that go to the city council so everyone can know and attend that meeting if they would like?
It's worth noting that it also go in front of the Historic Preservation Commission, who has the ability to, to propose some amendments as well, and so certainly interested in anything that they might say as well. But then proceed to the City Council.
When is the Historic Preservation Commission meeting?
That is Tuesday, next Tuesday at, help me out here, 6 o'clock? So,
Yeah.
6 o'clock in this room?
It is within the large conference room across the way.
Okay.
At 6 p.m.
6
Tuesday
p.m.
night,
Next Tuesday evening.
November 14th. Yes.
Does it have to get approval from them, or does it go to the city council no matter what?
Again, both bodies are recommending bodies, and so the recommendations are being forwarded to the city council, so there's no need for approval by either body, and they will still proceed to the city council.
Okay,
So.
and when will that be, when it?
We do have flexibility in terms of this because it's not a property application or anything, but we do anticipate moving it forward within the month of December, so that could be subject to change based on what happens at the Historic Preservation Commission and the desire of the sponsor of the bill. But would anticipate it going in front of the City Council in December with a public hearing on December 18th. We would be posting that information on website, as we do with all public hearings, and then advertising it as well, so people can pay attention to that to confirm the date.
So everybody should keep tuned with city website and other public avenues, correct?
Correct.
All right. Appreciate it. At this point, I think most of you came tonight for that. If you guys don't want to stay for the rest of our meeting, we'll let you all retire out of here and we'll continue on. Thank you guys for coming this evening. Next, we will move on to our other business. Eric, I believe you have some updates on our prior cases.
So I'd like to give updates on prior cases. There's really only one outstanding one, and that's regarding the short-term rentals. I'm afraid we're going to be on hold on that until we get some other things finalized with other chapters of the city code. And so we don't have a final date in terms of sending that on to the city council. It's very similar. We would, it is a public hearing item, so we would advertise it and post it on the website when it does proceed in that direction. Really, the timing is that we are wanting to align it with amendments to business licensing and lodging tax sections of the code, so that they all proceed to the city council at one time as one issue. So, other than that, we have adoption of the 2018 meeting schedule. That's been included in your packet and is up on the screen. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to announce that there are no dates that are needing to be changed, no vacations planned or holidays that affect the standard meeting schedule, at least so far.
Very good. Again, that would be the second Thursday of most months, as we've done in the past.
Second Thursday of every month as lined out for 2018. So.
All right, and I think with that being said, we need a motion and a normal second, and we'll vote.
So moved.
Yes.
We got a motion and a second. I don't think they want to discuss it. I think there's too many other commission members. I think there's too many other meetings and things like that. So we have a motion, a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, motion carries. Any other items this evening?
No, just to respond to Dale Vaughn, I believe I had to amend it or request the commission amend it once for a marriage or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, we are a very small staff, and so yeah,
Meeting
sometimes.
adjourned. Thank you.